Hey all, hope you're doing well. Hope you had a good week. I'm actually recording this on a Friday night, so you'll probably see this Monday, but hope you've had a good weekend by the time you watch this. Um, Thought I'd start with a little question for you today. What is the best thing about Switzerland? Question is, what is the best thing about Switzerland? Answer, I don't know, but its flag is a big plus. Pretty corny joke. I heard that the other day, so I figured I'd share that with you. As you can see, the Swiss flag is a big plus. I did not want to do that without a picture because I don't know how many of you know that the Swiss flag is actually has a plus. So, anyways, stupid joke, but I figured that would be kind of a funny way to start. And just switching gears a little bit. Um, we do have, so going back to our nationalism question, I'm going to focus continuing tonight on nationalism in World War One. Okay, so what we're going to look at is some of the things. So last time we talked about how nationalism kind of caused the war in Europe. Then we talked about the idea that we were trying to stay neutral to maintain our country, make the most money that we could. And that was kind of how nationalism worked for us then. We wanted to be kind of isolationist and yet make money and just keep expanding and continuing to make a good thing even better, right? So one of the things that happens is as we get involved now. Remember, 1916, Woodrow Wilson runs on "He kept us out of war." That was his slogan. Well, we went into the reasons why that only lasted for so long. With German unrestricted submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegram, and some of those other things. So what I just want to take a few minutes to do is kind of talk about, once we declared war, what did that mean for us? Okay, how do we see nationalism in our war effort? Okay, clearly when you have soldiers go fight for your country, that's nationalism. You're following orders, you're doing those things. So the first thing that we see is we see mobilization. What that means is your country basically gets ready to go to war. And only about 70% of those who were eligible to go, or were between the ages um, to go to war. It became 18 to 26, but there was a wider variety of that prior, when the war began. But this idea, once we were there, you know, we would be involved heavily. So one of the things that happens is this I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted. I thought I had a stat here on the age. Yeah, here we go. So for mobilization, the draft bill initially was for males 21 to 30 years old. So it was not even 18-year-olds like you're used to hearing. Okay. Um, so the prior draft was during the Civil War, and that was all hands on deck. In the Confederacy, they couldn't really institute a draft, but there was young kids that fought and things like that. But during World War One, it was 21 to 30. Later, it was expanded to be 18 to 45. They had to register at the local sheriff and governing boards to decide who should go. When they did that, they discovered that only about 70% of our soldiers were actually fit for service. Okay, so only 70% of those that actually showed up between those ages could be moved along to actually fight in the war. Now, those who were excluded were ministers, felons, aliens, and munitions workers. Those were considered people that were ineligible to be part of the American force. Okay, many tried to get married to avoid. Many got married to avoid the draft. Another way that you might be able to do that. And then almost 4,000 conscientious objectors. Okay, so we're starting to hear this now, where they asked to be assigned to non-combative situations for moral reasons, maybe taking care of soldiers or helping build things, but they were not to see combat because they were morally opposed to the war. There were still some Quakers who might fall into that category and people like that. So we end up having over 2 million people serve in European theaters. So to give that a little context, the population of Connecticut's a bit larger than that, but imagine, you know, close to that number of people, everybody that lives in Connecticut serving over in World War I. That would give you kind of an idea. 50,000 individuals die in France, okay? Compared with 3 million Russian, French, and British soldiers in other theaters, okay? So our losses were significantly less than what we see with other countries, okay? But some things happened that's interesting as far as nationalism goes. For instance, the demographics of our nation changed. Nearly 1 in 10 African Americans come north in what's known as, you know, something of a great migration here, because there's jobs. There's jobs in munitions factories and things like that. So we have 8.2% of African Americans leaving the South. Of course, in the North, they're going to find out that this is not the promised land, and measures are being passed to keep them out of certain areas, and they see discrimination is a real thing in the North as well. Also, 40,000 more women are hired to work in industries, okay? So this is going to immediately lead, of course, to after the war to some changes, okay? Offering more opportunity for women. Herbert Hoover, who's not the president, Wilson is, but he works in the administration, pioneers food conservation, like wheatless Mondays and meatless Tuesdays. So part of nationalism is we're not going to have wheat on Monday, we're not going to have meat on Tuesday, to save that for the war effort, for soldiers and things like that. This is where, by the way, reductions of electric power were asked to do that as well, to save for the war effort. This is where daylight savings time comes from, okay, to cut down on the amount of electricity we're using. And you know, if the time dictates and helps that light to stay on for more parts of the day, it's less time that you need to use your electricity. So that's where that came from. Also, prohibition was encouraged, and one of the things that fuels that, of course, you have the moral reasons that were happening in the cities, but it was also closely associated with the Germans. Germans liked and still like beer is a big part of their culture, just like wine is in Italy and France. But beer was connected to the Germans, and so people thought it was nationalistic to avoid drinking that. As silly as that might sound, that's really where we see this happen. And so alcohol content in some drinks was 10%. It goes down to 2.75%. Okay. Now, this is where the 18th Amendment is passed. And for prohibition, one thing that you may not realize is it denied you could not manufacture, transport, or sell liquor. It did not outlaw, though, the possession, consumption, or household production of liquor. So you could have it, you just couldn't sell it, you couldn't manufacture it, you know, produce it in mass quantity, or transport it. So you know, that's where people begin to make liquor in their bathtubs, known as bathtub gin, and poison themselves, kill themselves, and so this becomes a pretty big health hazard, in something that was done to kind of go against that for that reason. So you see nationalism there to kind of improve us morally. Everybody's getting on board to kind of help with the war effort. And then you have the Sedition Act that's passed, and this is a big one. So this is where it's going to limit speech during wartime. Okay, so it says that any speech that would interfere or go against the government during a time of war is considered a crime. Okay, so one of the things, so this is nationalism again. This happens in every type of conflict. I remember even in 9/11, there was discussion when, you know, a very small minority protested us going to Afghanistan. It was one of the few times in the recent past where everybody was pretty much on board. We needed to get rid of the Taliban, who had helped to orchestrate the attacks on the World Trade Center. They didn't really orchestrate it themselves, but they allowed Al Qaeda to train in their country, and so we went there and removed them from power. But there were a few, and at the time who were against it. And I remember at the time, a lot of Americans were saying they should be arrested for speaking against the war effort at a time of war. And one of the things that happens with the Sedition Act, you could not write or print anything disloyal against the government. Draft dodging or insubordination in the Army could have meant 20 years in jail. So this is going to continue on through the next many military conflicts until that idea comes to a head with the My Lai massacre in the Vietnam War, with Lieutenant Calley, and we'll talk about that later. But this war was popular; it was supported enthusiastically. George Creel produces propaganda for our pro-war country. All right. So there's a lot of propaganda in the theaters, again, showing the German Kaiser as a villain and all sorts of nasty stories and positive images of American soldiers fighting the bad guys. Okay. 2/3 of the money for the war is raised by loans. So people showing nationalism and things like that, willing to, kind of help pay for the war effort. Only 1/3 of the money is actually raised by taxes, where they force Americans through payroll taxes and things like that, which was a relatively new thing, by the way. 1913 actually was when that started. So prior to that, you didn't get money taken out of your paycheck by the government, and now this is kind of in full swing. Even something like hamburger. So think of having a hamburger. That was associated with the Germans, so now that's changed to Liberty Steak. We start calling that Liberty Steak. I think sauerkraut was actually changed to Liberty Cabbage, to avoid any type of German connection. Okay. Now, one of the big things that happens, and I think this is an interesting case for you're kind of thinking about nationalism. I'm just going to share the screen again for a second. If I can find it here anyways. Yeah, here we go. Let's see, it's under here. What is it? There we go. Okay. This is the issue of Charles Schenck. Okay, freedom of speech in World War I. It's on your Google Classroom page, Issues and Controversies in American History. Should Charles Schenck have gone to jail for encouraging others to oppose the draft? So I want you to just think about that for a second. Do you think that should be the case? Should a guy go to jail if he tells other people to oppose the draft? And so what Issues and Controversies kind of deals with is it gives you a bit of background on the case. What I like about this site too, and I know that I'm kind of geeking out over this site, but I really do like it. I wish I had it as a student, because it gives you a real summary of it in the beginning, and then as you get into it, it just keeps you focused. If you can get lost, because it is a lot of words, it's a bit of reading here, but it gives you a good background on this stuff. And one of the things that it talks about, so yes or no, the arguments for kind of arresting Schenck and putting him in jail is that you can't the law says that you can't interfere with recruitment during wartime. It's an emergency situation, and if your speech interferes with recruitment of the soldiers, then you are basically committing treason, maybe espionage, things like that. And those are serious crimes to be accused of. He did this because he was telling people to avoid the draft, to resist the draft, and he even sent some of these letters to people through the U.S. mail. So there was a lot of argument about that. This should not be allowed. This was illegal. And the other thing you should know is Schenck was a member of the Socialist Party. Okay, so where you see on the front of this is Eugene Debs, who was also criticizing the war effort. He was the leading socialist candidate. He ran for president. He actually ran for president from prison, but he was sentenced 10 years in prison. and his U.S. citizenship was revoked. And so he was eventually, Warren Harding pardoned him in 1921, but this was serious stuff. And the socialists argued this was just a big capitalist money grab. That's why we got involved in war, because we were worried about cash, making money as a nation, and this was an immoral reason to go to war. So Mr. Schenck, many argued that he should go to, he should be arrested for this. And it's very similar to the reasons why you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Now, movies were not a big part of anybody's life in 1917, but that's the illustration we use. You can, freedom of speech. Yeah, you're free. I don't have clamps on your jaw. You can, literally say anything, but you're going to suffer the consequences for some things that you say. Fire in a movie theater, I've got a bomb at an airport. You can say all those things all you want, but you're not going to be protected because you're creating a public safety concern. Okay, so your rights end when you violate everybody else's rights, that kind of idea. And so these were the arguments for prosecuting Schenck. The arguments against doing this was, if you don't protect political speech, then what kind of speech do you protect? Political speech is the most important type of speech to protect, because if you don't do that, you can have freedom of speech in areas that don't matter as anywhere near as much. If you don't allow people to speak politically, then you basically have you have a very dangerous situation on your hand. The other thing that was argued, of course, by the other side was that you're just punishing socialists. You're using this as an example to really go after the socialists that are pushing back on your policies. It was similar. So the Sedition Act in 1791, when the Federalists tried to shut up Jefferson and the Democrat Republicans when they were, going against their policies, okay, concerning France, and the Jefferson, and again, to critique the government policies, Sedition Acts passed and said you can't say anything slanderous against the government. That was even more extreme, because it it didn't even limit that to war and things like that. It was just government policy. So we see this again, okay, during World War I. And the other thing that that they argued was, he should, if this should only be allowed if there's, you should only be able to stop somebody's speech if there was an immediate threat that was going to occur because of it. Now, so they're arguing, listen, we are not leading to anybody's deaths here. We are just saying that you should, for moral reasons, those who are going to listen are not going to go for those reasons. But that's kind of what the other side is arguing too. So I don't know what would happen today. I think this would be a much more spirited discussion if this case came up today for the first time 100 years later. But it goes to the Supreme Court, and they rule 9-0 that Schenck should be arrested. That it was a violation of the act. It was constitutional for this to happen. And that's that. I mean, 9-0. This was a unanimous decision. And what's interesting, you might say, well, who cares? Well, one of the things that happens a couple years after this, and think about this for nationalism too, is we have a Red Scare in 1920-21 in this country, where people who are suspected of communism, going to communist meetings, having communist leanings, some of those things are rounded up and arrested as well. Think about what that would have been like if this had ruled the other way. What if they protected Schenck's speech and said, no, he had a right to do that? Would the Red Scare have happened? Would communism have been a viable option in the 1920s, 30s? That's something interesting to think about. As our country went into a depression in the 1930s, had communism not been shut down and demonized the way it was, would there have been potential for people to choose that type of government? I still don't think so, but you did have 100,000 people leave this country during the Depression era and move to the Soviet Union. It might have been much larger than that, but still, I think there was enough of a foundation of democracy, freedom, and free speech where that probably wouldn't have happened. But it's interesting to think about how history would have been rewritten if this decision had gone another way. Um, and during World War II, you're not going to have much, much pushback either against the war effort. Korea, same thing, not much. Okay, it's going to start to become a little bit unpopular when people started to look at it as a tie and a stalemate. But boy, by the time we get to Vietnam, that's a game changer. Okay, so we see that is in play here. So just some ideas about nationalism for your paper. We really see it here with the war effort, willing to sacrifice for the good of the country, whether it's electricity or meat, whether it's to stop speech that could interfere with the war effort. A lot of evidence here of nationalism. The propaganda being that allowed, people didn't push back on that. They said, yeah, this is all pro-America, anti-German. Interesting note, after World War I, that's actually going to be one of the reasons we drag our feet to get involved in World War II, because we realized that some of the reporting of George Creel was less than honest. So a lot of people feel like we were kind of manipulated to get into the war, and we don't want to make that mistake again. So just some thoughts about World War I. And that's it for tonight. So hopefully, if you watch these videos, a good thing to do is to keep an outline in front of you while we talk about this and kind of fill it in as you go. And then, man, by the time you get to actually write the paper, you just kind of, there it is for you. Not a bad idea. But again, hope you can, hope you're continuing to hang in there, stay positive. A lot of you drive and do things like that. One of the big things that's happening in Pleasant Valley, there's a drive-in. If you've never gone to a drive-in, a lot of you probably have, but it's a cool thing to do. You can socially distance yourselves. You can go up there. I don't know how they're going to do it. You do need cash, but it might be a way you can get out of the house, stay safe, stay socially distanced from other people, and still feel like you're actually out seeing people. And they're showing The Invisible Man, I think, at 10, and there's another kind of cartoonish movie at 8 or whenever it gets dark. But one of my great memories of childhood is going to the drive-in. It's kind of cool. It's a throwback. If you don't know where that is, it's up by People's Forest, where that big bridge is as you go into the airport. Take a right before that bridge, and it's right down on your right. I'm kind of backtracking, but how do you get there? Well, you go to Winston, to Route 8. And when that ends, you essentially take a right and just keep going until you see a flashing yellow light. And you take a left, and that'll bring you right to that bridge where you take a right to go to the drive-in. But you don't need me to tell you that because you have GPS now. It's Pleasant Valley Drive-In. So that's just my recommendation. And it's going to be a little cold, though. That's the only thing. But it should be open for the season. Email me if you need anything. I miss everybody. And even though we won't be seeing each other, I'm looking forward to the day that we do, whether it be the summer or the fall, when we can finally go out and and go to school somehow. So again, let me know if you need anything. I hope you had a good weekend.